Our guest today is Dr. Alan Waltar. He has a long and illustrious career in nuclear engineering. He has served as the Director of Nuclear Energy for the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. He served as the head of the Department of Nuclear Engineering at Texas A&M University. He's been the president of the American Nuclear Society. He's also authored several books, which you can see there, Radiation and Modern Life and America the Powerless. Alan and his wife, Anna, founded Ingalls Creek Enrichment Center, of which my parents were among the first board members. And, while at first blush it might seem like that operating a retreat center would seem to have little to do with a career as a nuclear engineer, I would submit that there's some interesting points of deep connection. And Ingalls Creek's mission is, and I've got it written down here, to gather people who seek to connect their faith, life, and work in the richness of community, sending them into our changing society with a renewed sense of Christian calling. And this is how Alan has approached his career in nuclear engineering. It's a calling from the Lord. And so I will now shut up and turn it over to Alan, and he can either defend or refute anything that I've just said about him. So welcome, Alan, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Scott. First thing I noticed on my screen here, it says your internet connection is unstable. And that is one of the plagues. We have a beautiful site up here at Ingalls Creek Enrichment Center, but we are kind of at the end of the road. And this is what happens with the internet. It's very good when it's very good, but then it just goes down. So at some point, you may not hear me at all. If you do, just kind of start waving your hands and we'll shut up for a while. I guess it was the faith and science aspect that really intrigued me when Scott and Dan asked that I share with you, because to me, my faith and my profession have to be connected in complete concert. Otherwise, something is wrong with the other. And I guess in reflecting back, the first time that this is really a test for me is when I was on a reverse sabbatical teaching at the University of Virginia. This was back in 1976. This was the time when Jimmy Carter was elected president, you might remember. And Carter was presumably a nuclear engineer, or at least he worked for Admiral Rickover. And he was a Christian, so I voted for him. I thought, hey, man, these are going to be the glory days. Well, as you all know, he had a different view of nuclear power. In fact, he never said this in so many words. I'm talking President Carter, but he implied that plutonium was evil. That was the implication. He was very concerned about proliferation. Well, that really got to me. And I spent probably a couple of months really wrestling. Should I get out of nuclear engineering because somehow this is evil, or should I stay? And I can't say that God ever spoke to me in terms, but I had a very strong feeling that he wanted me to stay in nuclear engineering because of all the incredible benefits this could provide to humanity. Well, my next real test, though, was the 1995, I guess, where I was elected president of the American Nuclear Society, and I was starting concerned about this whole radiation issue because there are 4 factors that really bother people, as you know, about nuclear power. One is safety, the waste question, proliferation, and the cost. And except for proliferation, those other 3 directly involve radiation. It's the fear of radiation. I probably should have tried to do more about it when I did, but at that time, our focus was on saving plutonium because the National Academy of Sciences wanted to bury the plutonium. And we got Glenn Seaborg and several people internationally to basically spend a year studying that problem, and we saved our plutonium, which was an accomplishment. But then, of course, along came, well, this was actually for the Chernobyl. I was invited to go to Chernobyl on the 9th anniversary because they knew at the 10th anniversary there'd be a huge international focus. So I took my wife with me. A week before going there, I'd spent a week in Poland, and Dr. Wojciech, who worked directly for Hans Blix at the IAEA, showed us around. It was very, very nice. He was just a very comfortable guy. As we left at the airport, Anna said, Dr. Wojciech, my husband wants to take me to Chernobyl. Will I be safe? Here we'd been married for already 30 years at that point. She didn't trust me. He put his hand on her shoulder, said, yes, Mrs. Waltar, will be safe. So we got to see, and I was quite impressed actually with the people that were still living there at Slavutich, and came away with a much warmer feeling. And of course, we all know that Chernobyl, it was horrible from the standpoint, 10,000 abortions and so forth. but really not a lot of damage due to radiation. I'll come back to that issue later, because after that hysteria died down, along came Fukushima. I want to tell a little story about this. Fukushima occurred in March in 2011. 3 months before that, the American Nuclear Society Student Conference invited me to be their banquet speaker, and they wanted to know the title of the talk. This was now before Fukushima. At that time, 60 nations were pounding on the door at the IAEA wanting to get into nuclear power. It was the time of Renaissance. So I gave the title, The Nuclear Resonance. Timing is everything, exclamation mark. Timing is everything. And then along came Fukushima. So what I did, I stood up, I said, you know, I started showing some slides of England and in particular London. The Germans were bombing London, and it was a shambles, and it was a horrible time. And then you remember a gentleman took the cigar out of his mouth and he said, "Let all men say, this was England's finest hour." Huh? We all know who we're talking about. I said, you know, once we understand what really happened at Fukushima, I think we can say this was nuclear's finest hour. What? What kind of idiot's trying to tell me this? Well, you know the story. Yes, there were some, I don't know, 10, 20,000 people died, mostly from the floods and so forth. And of the 16,000 people that were evacuated, 1,600 people died. From radiation? No, not a single person was even injured from radiation. And that's just not a personal opinion. That came down from ICRP, UNSCEAR, and so forth, the top regulatory guidance agencies in the world. It was not radiation, it was the anxiety, it was the desperation, suicide, alcohol, and so forth. Nobody likes to be evacuated for years and years and years. Anyway, so that really got to me. Well, then not too far after that, the ANS said, what can the ANS do about this? Andy Klein, you might remember, was the president back about 4 years ago, and he issued what he called the Grand Challenge. What can we do in the nuclear business that maybe we can't solve it right now, maybe not even next year, maybe not even 10 years from now, but what are the huge obstacles that we have to overcome? And there were some 300 submissions, I think, from the Wanda Munn and I issued the question on the challenge of radiation. We need to solve this whole question and get rid of the fear, the unnecessary, the unjustified fear of low-level radiation. And actually, that was the one that the board finally accepted as the grand challenge number 1. Well, I guess at that point, what I thought I would do at this point is share with you a brief slide presentation, a PowerPoint. And I kind of apologize in advance. I didn't make any new slides. I just kind of cherry picked from a few, but I thought it might keep me more on track if I kind of share this journey with you and why I'm trying at my old age here to really still do something about this fear of radiation. So, Scott, if you'll throw up the first slide after we're done with flourishing here with Mid-Columbia. I don't have control of the slides, he does. But why do we even focus on low-level radiation? Well, it says my internet is unstable, so maybe you can't see that. But just go on down here, Scott, as you can. That's the unique feature of our profession. Nuclear science, nuclear power is like any other major enterprise. It's a huge enterprise. But the one unique thing is radiation, and that's what's scaring people. So if you can continue down here, otherwise it's just another high-tech industry, but it's this unjustified fear of low-level radiation that severely limits the acceptability of nuclear technology. All right, just kind of continue on here, Scott, and throw up the next few graphs. We'll see what it says here. The unjustified fear. Well, 3 Mile Island, you know, that was a huge scare. That was when Walter Cronkite had credibility. He signed off one night and said, "I don't know about you, but I'm scared." And that's the way it is. That's the way it is. Well, we know that there was no radiation concern there, but it did ratchet up the number of regulatory rules and regulation. It skyrocketed, caused a major slowdown of construction in the United States. Then the Chernobyl accident came along, as I mentioned, some 10,000 abortions, needless abortions in Europe. We're getting to some ethical questions here, and that's what's driving me. Major slowdown in the nuclear power plant construction worldwide. Yet, if we look at the wildlife around Chernobyl, the wildlife is thriving. You know, the problem there was not radiation, it was human beings. And after Fukushima, again, 1,600 actual deaths due to the prolonged evacuation, but none, absolutely none, due to serious injuries or deaths from radiation. Yet it closed down all the nuclear power plants in Japan. They were 31% nuclear, and they closed them all down. They're importing natural gas at huge expense, phased out Germany and so forth. So we understand what the implications here. Go on, Scott. Let's see what we got next here. If we can go on. I wish just for, yeah.
Yes.
Well, this is just kind of a recap, and some of these things are not. But yeah, I might mention this. A lot of the hospitals are shutting down if they're radio treatment centers. Doctors, nuclear doctors, are going out of business because of the paperwork. That fourth bullet down there, irradiating food, that's the best thing that's come along, and yet thousands of people die every year from the pathogens in seafood and so forth. There's a huge expense in the whole nuclear fuel cycle. I went up to Canada, went down into the uranium mines and took a huge infrastructure associated with this.
Yep.
In fact, that's one of the concerns. Even within our industry, there are people that would oppose getting rid of the LNT, the linear no threshold, because it provides a lot of jobs, and that's something we need to be concerned about. Let's keep going here, Scott. See what's next. So the challenge: we just have to remove the unjustified public fear of low-level radiation. It's an enormous challenge, because people just fear it. You can't see it, you can't smell it. Therefore, it's that ghost, if you will. Now, this linear no threshold thing, I think most of you here know that. Basically, the current model that's used throughout the world is that it's a linear relation. We know at high levels, radiation can be very, very dangerous. It can cause death. The question is, what about low-level radiation? Well, they just assume it's a straight line down to zero. That it eked back to zero, you could get a carcinogen as a result of radiation. And that's been with us for over half a century. It's through it permeates through all of our codes. I think is there another book on here? Yeah. But somehow, how can we use modern science to modify these standards? That's the question. We're scientists here. What can we do? Was there one more bullet here? Well, one of the first things we tried to do is say, let's get the radiation biologists and the radiation epidemiologists together to talk to each other. And Jim, I'm sure you know this, the epidemiologists don't talk to the biologists and vice versa. They're very different topics, and so we got them together. Well, how do we do this? The next slide was kind of and here's where Ingalls Creek comes in a little bit, Scott. I wanted to find out if there was some way to get the antagonists, get those that are sticking with the LNT together with those people who are saying, no, some low-level radiation actually might be good for you. Now, again, you say that in some circles, they start laughing, but I believe there's a lot of science to back that up. Let's get them up here to Ingalls Creek, and we actually got Bill Gates to fund this. He gave us about $15,000 so we could fly these. Abel Gonzalez from Argentina, Buenos Aires, he's a Catholic. By the way, he claimed to play soccer with Pope Francis when they were growing up. It's interesting guy. Very, very influential in international. Bill Morgan from P&L tragically died a few years ago. He was, again, very, very instrumental in the ICRP. And then the hormesis component. Hormesis means here that at low levels, it actually stimulates the system and is actually beneficial, has a beneficial effect. That's what they believe. Jerry Cutler of Canada is a strong proponent of that. And this guy, Ludwig van den Degen, I can't say enough for him. Ludwig is now 92 years old. He's a German medical doctor who's done an enormous amount of research. Very, very credible guy. He's a Catholic, interesting enough. Tony Brooks, some of you know from in the Tri-Cities. You know, Tony's one of these shucks guys. Nobody can get mad at Tony Brooks. You know, he can blend things together here and make a good sauce. And he's an excellent biologist. He, in fact, was the chief scientist when Domenici put together a Department of Energy low dose program a decade or so ago. Tony's the chief scientist, so he knows the business. Well, anyway, the purpose here was to have an environment conducive to, you know, getting together. And rather than shouting at each other, the first night I said, we're not going to mention the word radiation. We were here for 3 days. You know, who did you grow up? What kind of an environment did you grow up in? You know, why did you go into this profession? Kind of, you know, those kind of things. Get to know each other on a personal basis. And in fact, it sort of worked. People started talking together and say, hey, we're all trying to do the same thing. We have different backgrounds, different biases. We actually resulted in a paper out of that called The High Price of Public Fear of Low Radiation. The next view graph, the next thing, Van den Degen knows, I mean, he knows all these people at Oak Ridge, John Hopkins, National Institute of Health, and so forth. We got together again. Bill Gates funded this. We got together to say, what can come out of this meeting? So the next view graph, if you're still awake, Scott, is the meeting itself that we held in Pasco. This was in September. Yeah, next view graph.
Next one there? Or-
There, that one. Yeah, yeah. And many of you were involved in that. And I think, you know, we knew we weren't going to solve this problem, but we got the biologists and the epidemiologists together. And I think we realized we need each other. And that's the only way we're going to solve this problem. In the next view graph, I don't remember what. Oh, yeah, there are these, of course, three voices. There are the linear, no threshold advocates. Then there's these, hey, no, there's a threshold. Let's face it, there's a threshold, frankly, for everything. Trace elements, even arsenic, we know at high levels will kill us. We know things like aspirin at high levels will kill. At low levels, we need them. And so intuitively, even though I'm not a biologist, I really believe there's a threshold for anything. The poison is in the dose. So there's the threshold advocate. And then there's these, what are called the adaptive response, that low-level radiation actually stimulates the system to produce a hormetic or a beneficial effect. We got them working together. We can't say we solved it, but at least they talk to each other. And the spin-off from that was Bill Magwood, who many of you remember, is now, he was head of nuclear energy at Department of Energy, and then he went over to the NRC as a commissioner. He was the only one that had any control over the guy that was the head of the thing when Fukushima came about. And he's now the Director General at the OECD NEA in Paris. And even though he said earlier, when we talked about getting this conference together, I've known Bill for a long time. He said, no sense. We can never get off this. We're just going to have to live with it. He came around and he said, you know, there's something to this. How about we take the next step? So he put together a working conference, which ended up in Lisbon, which was just about a year ago, January or February, January of 2020. I guess it was the last trip I took on the airplane before the COVID hit. And the whole purpose there, let's look at the low-hanging fruit. We're not going to solve this LNT right now. We can work at it, but let's look reasonableness, the Arlara principle, rather than saying that the risk, we have to keep the radiation level as low as possible. Let's look at the benefits involved. We have to balance this thing. And so I think it was relatively successful. Does the next view graph cover that? I can't remember. Yeah, well, I probably should have put this earlier for those that are maybe kind of new to this. It is a very complex thing, but we know if we look at the abscissa here, we increase the dose at some point in time above, say, a sievert or so. Yeah, there's some serious consequences. We know that people can die at that point. And so that if we look at the ordnance over there, again, that's the reliable database. We got that from the atomic bombs and so forth. So we know that deaths can happen at very high levels. Well, what about down here? That linear hypothesis simply says it's a straight line. Now, there are some people that says on number C that, oh, it's even worse down there. I don't know of any credible scientist that subscribes to that. A is sort of the threshold. It comes down to a certain point. Here I put like 100 millisieverts as kind of a general area. And then below that, there's no effects. But then side B said, no. Below that, there's some actual hermetic effects, some beneficial effects. Well, those are the things that people argue about. I put on here the Japanese public exposure, because of course, after Fukushima, there was this big concern. The average exposure was about 3.7 millisieverts for that whole duration. Some were higher. Some were the people that worked on inside the plant to put it down. But that was the average. If the next view graph, I believe if I've got this correct, shows background levels around the world. And you notice the United States, which is down in red, that's about the same, about 3 millisieverts is background. It's actually about twice that if we include medical benefits and so forth. But again, the whole the average to the a citizen in Japan during Fukushima was about the same as the background in the United States. So do we worry about background? Well, of course not. Also, I put one other thing here which really has gotten to me. The question is, what about repositories? That's one of the questions. What do we do with nuclear waste? The limit from the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, for a repository is 0.15 millisieverts per year, that down there. This is about 20 times below background. And that's at 10,000 years. How can anybody have even a shred of credibility in that sort of thing? It's just crazy. But yet that's what's holding up nuclear technology. To me, this has become a very profound ethical issue. All right, let's move on then to see what else we've got here. I think there's a few more photographs. Yeah. So what is the biological response? I mentioned Abel Gonzalez from Argentina, a very good friend of mine. I've been involved with what's called the nuclear World Nuclear University for the past 15 years. It's really getting together the sharp people all over the world together for about 6 weeks and get top presenters from the IAEA, General Electric, Westinghouse, and so forth together. And Abel has been gives the story on on radiation, and remember he subscribed to the LNT, but he is saying, this is a quote from him: no competent pathologist can attribute human harm to radiation doses below background. You just can't do it. There's just too many other things that cause carcinogens. In fact, radiation is a very poor carcinogen. Well, I think there's another couple of points here for the biological response, Scott, if you kind of continue down the line. There is strong experimental evidence for an adaptive response. That is, at low levels of radiation, that's sort of well, basically, it stimulates the system so that if you have a high dose after that, it's far less damaging. Because it prevents the, it removes cell damage and so forth. And I see Jim nodding his head here. He knows far more about this than I know about it. The problem is, if you just look at physics alone, and I consider myself more of a physicist, I'm not a biologist. Well, yeah, you increase dose, you have more hits. And that's what the old LNTs are saying. But that's just not true at low level. The biological response is nonlinear. It's not linear. Is that true, Jim? Raise your hand. Put your hand up. Put your thumbs up. There you go. Okay, next view graph. Some of this is a kind of a repeat, because I said I just kind of picked it. We know at high dose, cellular damage increases pretty much linear. I mean, that's not quite true, but at high doses, physics prevails. The immune system is simply overwhelmed. Therefore, I think there's general acceptance of this LNT, this linear non-threshold model for high dose. But at low dose, that's where we live in now. And frankly, that's the level we live in, even nuclear accidents, like for Fukushima and so forth. It's still pretty low dose. Cell damage still increases linear with dose, but the biological response is nonlinear. There's a whole chain of events that go up to the biological system. And in fact, adaptive response has been very clearly demonstrated experimentally. Now, the LN people don't accept it, but let's look at the implications here of this is kind of a repeat, but what is it? You tell them once, you tell them twice, you maybe remember. This public exposure is basically recommended by the international ICRP, 1 millisievert per year. Remember, that's about 3. Our background is 3 times that. And that's then for a race pod, this is one that really gets me. 15 millirems per year at 10,000 years, 0.15. I mean, this is absolutely absurd. It's almost impossible to build and license a repository. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy for the antis. They set these restrictions, the public accept them. We can't solve the waste problem. Serious ethical issues. Let's continue on here if anybody is still with me. Again, some of this unintended consequences, and I apologize, I am repeating, but once in a while I bring up a new point here. The tragedy from Fukushima, that was really what got me into this ethical thing. To say that the LNT is conservative, okay, it's not conservative if we're actually killing people. We actually kill people because people use the LNT as the basis for the evacuations. And again, another is a question of cost. I mean, the cost of billions that we're spending on nuclear waste cleanup and so forth. Well, it can be an infinite. You just can't build something where you can prove that in 10,000 years, there's going to be less than 1 millisievert per year. In fact, according to Jim Conca, he's done some work on this. He said, we could save about $420 billion alone just on the waste repository thing if we could get people to accept low-level radiation. In fact, he claims that the global cost of compliance to the LNT is of the order of $1 trillion. Now, I mean, these are serious, serious questions. Are you sound asleep? I think there's a couple more biographs here, Scott.
Yeah.
I mentioned, during the fuel cycle itself is a huge, every whether it's in milling fabrication, design, operation, so forth, there are radiations. Oh, we're keeping our radiation level down. In fact, there have been articles in earlier articles in Nuclear News where utilities are proud of the fact that they have less radiation than they did last year. Their plan is better than somebody else. And these are down in the weeds. Well, it's because public, looks at that, and it's just, in fact, we're sending the wrong message. We had Cynthia McCullough from the Mayo Institute at that ANS HPS meeting. It says, people are refusing CATs, and yet the benefits far, far outweigh the risks. And then I mentioned this food irradiation thing. It just, when I was down at Texas A&M, we really had made some great progress because we were able to convert, that has really helped. But still, here's the classic, now the nuclear people are not do their nuclear waste. They're going to put it in our food. Good God, and there are some people that believe that. It's just absolutely pitiful. If the internet will continue here somehow, let's try another slide. Now this is kind of an interesting thing here. Remember the linear no threshold people assume that radiation damage is down to zero, right? They assume that, but if it's a threshold, then there's not much damage below that threshold, or if there's an adaptive response, there's some. This shows basically dose versus damage. Now maybe showing that as we go along the abscissa, increasing the dose, what happens? The linear no threshold says, it starts at zero, and every bit of radiation we add, it causes harm. The threshold said, no, there's no harm until we get to a certain point. And then there's adaptive response that says, no, at low levels, below some level, it actually provides a benefit. But this all assumes that we're looking at radiation at background levels. What happens if we go to zero radiation, really zero radiation? And then I had an interesting story, at least it's an interesting story to me. So if you could show, what if in fact we reduced radiation to absolute zero? Now this is very difficult to do, but in fact there have been several people of both plants or animal cells in a lead enclosure and put it deep down in a deep underground cave, if you will, so that the radiation is not zero, but it's 2 orders of magnitude below background, essentially zero. And they take the same samples and put them up at the biological surface. Now, if you believe that radiation is zero, let's see what actually happened. You'd assume that, in fact, if you got down to zero here, that, man, things would be great. Things would be really thriving because if you increase the radiation, it's bad. But in fact, it shows just the opposite. It shows that those plants and cells and so forth at zero dose don't thrive. I don't understand damage there. There's all kinds of things going on such that at zero dose, literally zero dose, life does not thrive. We need some radiation. Radiation appears to support life. So then if you get to the next view graph, I think this is basically, showing that, one more here. We're almost done. Okay. Well, the whole point is here that in fact, there's kind of and in reality, and that I think is very interesting. Internet is unstable again. Let's look at the implications of this being the case. Some science is coming to life here. The LNT, a threshold model appears to be conservative, and an adaptive model probably is the most consistent with the data. And I think this is what the radiation biologists really believe. There's still work to be done here to really convince the naysayers, but it looks very promising that somehow low-level radiation, not only is it not harmful, it actually is beneficial. Can you imagine if the public really accepted this, how it would change our whole outlook? Profound implications. So let's look at the next view graph. The question is if a threshold model could be used. I remember talking with Abel Gonzalez way back, this 15 years ago when I first met him at the first World Nuclear University. I said, Abel, I know you believe in the LNT, but let's make an assumption that maybe 10 years from now or 20 years from now, we can prove that a threshold model or hermetic model is a reality, and LNT is not supported. What would you say to that? I said, well, it'd be very difficult to regulate. What? Well, here's the answer, I think. How can we be sure that individual has not exceeded the defined threshold? Well, the question is, I mean, what Abel would say, well, everybody's going to be required to wear a monitor because you're always getting some radiation. It's building up and building up and building up. And we have to record this so we know whether you're going over this threshold. But that concern is based on the premise that radiation damage is accumulative. Well, again, I mean, I'll see whether Jim is going to back me up on this, but I believe the biologists are saying, no, it's not accumulative. There may be a little bit accumulative, but fundamentally, the damage is repaired, it's repaired. And therefore, a threshold model, as I think we say on the next graph, would be totally useful for regulation. And this just says that a lot of background has been done to show that accumulated radiation dose and at a low rate, these are low dose rates, produce very little damage. Whatever damage is there is pretty much taken care of, it's repaired. Therefore, bottom line, a threshold model would be very easy to administer. It would completely change.
You're kind of
well,
spotty.
this is the last view graph, and I know it's a tough one, but it's still unstable.
Yeah.
There are very few people who have lived through the last 50 years when this fear of radiation has been compounded and compounded. So, and Tony is a radiation biologist. So he said, yeah, let's go back and look how these early concerns of the fear of radiation have occurred. And then what has the science shown to dispel these fears? And the first probably effects that the general populations were the atomic bombs. Oh my gosh, radiation, and granted, atomic bomb is a lot of radiation. More people died from the blast than from radiation, but nevertheless, it's a serious concern. And then they said, oh my gosh, it's going to cause cancer. Well,
I'm wondering if folks should, put your questions together and send them in via the chat. If Alan is able to rejoin us in the next few minutes, great. But if he's not, we'll have those questions.
Oh, here he is. All right. Are you able to speak in here?
I don't know. Yeah. Well, you don't probably need to put that last view graph on. Oh gosh, I don't know. Basically, Tony has lived through. He knows how to answer all these questions. Then he asked me to can you hear me at all?
Yes.
Yeah. He basically wanted to have, it's frustrating. Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
No? No voice, huh?
Well, I can hear you.
Frozen?
I can hear you, Alan.
Well, you can hear me? Okay. Well, basically, Tony is the guy that behind all this, but then he said, "Oh, all right." Anyway, so he asked if I get involved and look at what the implications of fear, because somebody's got if Jim Conca writes in Forbes Mag is very, very good. One of the things, in addition to all those other fears, is this whole question of how radiation can be used in COVID-19. That is really a fascinating story. Again, I don't know if I'm talking to myself here or if anybody can hear me, but
we can hear you.
Low-level radiation has been used for 50 years or so for certain kinds of flu and whatnot. And so the thought was, well, radiation can't cure COVID, but most of the deaths that occur to COVID where they require ventilation is when all of a sudden the immune system kicks in and goes into overdrive. This it just completely gets unhinged. And low-level radiation has been shown in some of the early stages to in fact calm that system down and save people from dying. The tragedy is that the medical people are afraid of radiation and they simply won't allow it to be used. And yet probably every hospital in the country has the capability of administering low-level radiation to patients so they won't have to go on the ventilator and it'll save their life. So again, these are ethical issues. And I'm just sharing with you at least what driving me in the gut to somehow try to somehow overcome this unjustified fear of low-level radiation. Well, that's really basically all I had to share, and I figured there's 10 million questions, although I don't know if anybody can hear me or get on. Looks like that's basically what I had prepared, Scott, and I think at this point it is 1:45. If anybody can communicate, if there's anything there, and unleash your mics and start peppering me with saying what.
Well, actually, we have several questions that have been put in the chat, and I can read them to you. Can you hear me all right?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, well, the first one is regarding the paper that you referenced last. Well, where will this be published?
Oh, we don't know. That's interesting. In fact, we're very concerned about trying to get the word out. We'd like to be able to publish it in Science or in or Lancet or something like that, but it's probably too large to do that, and these are kind of anti-nuclear magazines to begin with. So one thought would be to have it published in something like the International Journal of Radiation Protection, which we know the editor, and Tony's pretty sure we can get it published. It's a long paper. It's got about, I don't know, 50 or 60 references. And then have a shortened version published in Nuclear News for the nuclear community. Maybe Science or something would accept a shorter version. But that is a question, if it's a credible paper and really shows that science has quelled this need for being afraid of low-level radiation, that needs out to the public and policymakers. So it's a serious, we don't know how best to get this out. But I think probably we're going to try to publish it in one of the radiation magazines in full, and then have shortened versions for other publications.
Okay, great, thank you.
But if anybody has any ideas, the editor of the Atlantic or New Yorker, well, it would sure be, I'd like to try that.
Another question,
anybody
what about
still there?
fears of nuclear materials waste falling into the wrong hands? I don't know.
Well, there have been situations where radiation has fallen into the wrong hands. There's several cases. There was one in Brazil sometime. In some of these machines and so forth, gamma radiators and so forth, there have been some cobalt and whatnot thrown into the ash can or irresponsibly, and people have gotten a hold of it and gotten here. There are several deaths associated with nuclear waste, if you will, really high level waste getting into the wrong hands. I'm not aware of anybody, though, has gotten into what we consider high level waste, the kind of stuff that's going to the WIP project. Maybe somebody here knows of that. I'm not aware that any of that has gotten out of hand. It's really the waste from medicine and other places where it's easy to get your hands on. So I'm not aware of anybody that's gotten held of what we consider high level waste, very, very heavily guarded. Maybe if somebody knows something I don't know, let me know. But otherwise, I think it's been the waste from the medical industry and from industry. Where industry, by the way, I guess some of you might know here, radiation is used extensively in the world of medicine, agriculture, industry, space technology, environmental protection. In fact, Elsevier magazine, Elsevier is a big publishing company, they just decided to publish a major encyclopedia on nuclear energy. And the editor, Hugh Greenspan at Berkeley, who I know well, felt that there should be one chapter on the non-power applications. How does radiation technology affect our everyday life, if you will, outside nuclear power? He asked me to be the editor, and like a dimbat, I agreed to do it. Realized I don't much about this. I wrote a book on this but many years ago. It just sort of skipped the rock across the surface. But because the authors are all over the world, most of them are from India or Norway or Sweden or the IAEA, and English is not their maiden language. So guess what an editor gets to do? Anyway, there's 25 chapters on that. The economic impact of radiation in the non-power industry dwarfs that of nuclear power. We just don't realize how important it is. And so But it's through some of those other things in industry and medicine where there have been waste products that have been improperly disposed of, or in a food irradiation process, if somebody gets behind and doesn't follow the procedures. So there have been some deaths associated with that, but I don't think any of them from what we call high-level waste.
Jim mentioned the former Soviet control problems early on might also, I'm assuming that was in reference to that question, Jim? Yeah, You made the comment about possible Soviet control problems in the early days.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There was a very concern after Glasnost and so forth when the Soviet Union went down. I don't know that we have been appreciative of how desperate the economic conditions were in Russia, and people that had control of this stuff could make a lot of money by getting some of their materials into the wrong hand. A lot of them were tempted to do so. I was there. I've talked to some of these people who they were desperate. We just didn't realize how bad things were economically. So there was a huge push on the international scale, and several people from Pacific Northwest Laboratory were involved in helping to guard that sort of thing. And again, I never got directly involved in that, so I may be wrong here, but I'm not aware that any of the actual weapons material got into the wrong hands. If somebody here knows that, I'd be interested in knowing, but I don't think any of the actual weapons material got in the wrong hand. One of the things that happened, a lot of the highly enriched uranium that they had was blended down from 90% or so down to 5%, so it was used in our nuclear reactors. In fact, it was really interesting. The head of the World Nuclear Association, I'm trying to remember his name, Cameco was one of the major producers of uranium up in Canada. And there was a time where he headed a negotiation between the Russians and the United States to basically blend down their highly enriched uranium they were using for weapons to be used for civilian purposes. And it was totally against his profit motive. He wanted to sell uranium from the mines. I thought that was an incredible, magnificent humanitarian move that he recognized for the benefit of humanity. We should, in fact, blend down that material and use it rather than buying his uranium. I've always admired that. So a lot of their weapons, but they still have lots of weapons. We have lots of weapons. I just don't know that actually enriched material or plutonium has gotten into the wrong hands. I don't know that because I don't work in that area, but I don't think there has been a major problem there. The advanced nuclear reactor built at Hanford. Well, I don't really know any more than you do. The Department of Energy has given funding to two organizations. One is X Energy, I think, with the pebble bed reactor, and the other one to TerraPower for a sodium reactor. And presumably the preferred site is Hanford. I heard a presentation a month or so ago by the CEO of Energy Northwest and saying, yeah, they're both scheduled to be built here at Hanford. It's great news. The most recent news I saw is XL Energy is pretty well committed. I don't know about TerraPower. I haven't heard more. The TerraPower is interesting in the sense that it's a sodium-cooled reactor. A lot of experience at Hanford on sodium-cooled systems because that was FFTF. The unique feature is that they have a huge storage system, a sodium storage system, so it can load follow, and that's kind of their niche. But I don't, you guys in the Tri-Cities probably know more about those. It's good news if they come through. Hanford will have a real advantage of being, the stopping place for the next generation plants. At one time, I think NuScale was interested there, but that kind of got veered over to INL. So I don't know. I hope it's real.
Okay, I'll post another one in your chat there. It says, is DOE working with IOM or other federal agencies on the comparative risk management of nuclear versus other current energy generation technologies like fossil fuel?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right.
John Zimmerman can answer that question.
Okay. Well, let's move on to. I got to scroll back up here. Oh yeah. Terry is asking, where do you see God's fingerprints in this work? That's a good question.
I'm kind of the incurable optimist. I know a lot of my colleagues are saying, nuclear is going down now, it's never coming back. And the zealots are saying, renewables, solar and wind and so forth. And economically, they're looking well. And that's because of the huge subsidies, which the public doesn't understand. But one of the things that Jim Conca revealed a few months ago is that nuclear energy is renewable. Yeah, it's renewable. Well, when I first heard that, I said, yeah, for the fast spectrum reactors. I mean, I've written a couple of books on that, and sure, that'll extend us up at least to a millennia or two, a couple thousand years. It's not forever. But he's basically saying that, confirming the Japanese have been working for a long time on extracting uranium from seawater. Say, good Lord, it's only a few parts per billion, but PNL and Oak Ridge have been working on that too. The costs are down to where, if he's right, it costs about 3 times as much to extract uranium from seawater as it does to dig it out of the ground. But the costs are coming down all the time, number one. And number two, the cost of fuel for nuclear is a very small percentage of the overall cost. And therefore, that's going to go on forever, because whatever uranium is extracted, it's going to just more is going to you'll never be depleted. Well, maybe never, maybe in a few billion years. But the point is, to be able to say nuclear power is renewable, I think is kind of a game changer. And I think when people start looking at the reality of what wind and solar can do, I'm not opposed to wind and solar. I'm thinking in places they make sense. But to say that somehow they're going to do the full job is ridiculous. And I think it's just a blatant lie. Let's put it that way. It can't be done. I'm aware of one of the guys who's done a pretty comprehensive study, said that it's just impossible. You look at the actual engineering reliable baseload. You can't go over, I don't know what the number is, 60% or something like that of those unreliable sources. Because of course, wind and solar both, are very unreliable. And there's a certain point you cannot do it. Plus, we're going now more towards electric cars. It's going to the transportation. The demand for electricity is going to continue. So if we're really going to get rid of fossil fuels, which is going to take a long time to do, we are not going to do it with solar and wind alone. We need a reliable base source. In fact, nuclear is the one that really has the non-carbon footprint, renewable, reliable. It has to happen. So I guess the religious overtone that would need it to say, God's going to say, yes, ultimately nuclear power is going to save us all. Right, Jim? He's not there. Maybe he can't hear me. I think God's still in charge.
Well, we are coming up to the 2 o'clock hour, and I told Terry Andre that I would give her a few minutes to kind of wrap things up. But if anyone wants to stick around, are you able to do that, Alan? Stick around for another half hour, if anyone wants to hang out. But anyway, Terry will sort of dismiss the official part of our gathering, and anyone who wants us to leave at this point is certainly free to do so, which of course you've always been free to do so. But if you would like to stick around, we would be happy to.
And I got to apologize for this internet connection. I didn't know what to do about it.
Well, no, that's not your fault. We understand that we always have technical limitations. So anyway, Terry, Andre.
Okay. Well, first off, I want to thank you, Alan, for coming. And I know I learned a bunch today. I also just want to thank everybody else for being here also. And I would encourage you, if you know a scientist who is a person of faith and somebody who would love to share their passion with this group, please let us know who you might have in mind, and send some suggestions along. You're welcome to come and visit with our group anytime. We meet every Tuesday afternoon at 1 o'clock. We don't always have a guest speaker, Sometimes we have a video, sometimes we chat among ourselves, but our focus is on how our faith is reflected in the things that we do. And most of the people involved in this group are scientists or engineers. So we want to give God the glory. We want to thank you all for coming. And if you do have a chance to stick around for a little bit, that would be wonderful. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I've got ourselves in the other. Okay, so if you want to hang out some more, we do have some other questions here. Let's see. Let me scroll back up. Okay. There's an interesting question. Kit McGilliard asks, what do you think would be the consequences if we just walked away from Hanford cleanup at this time?
Well, hate to say this, but probably no consequences at all. I mean, there have been some studies done on the. That's too cavalier. That's too cavalier. I mean, we know that some of the tanks have been leaking and so forth, but I've seen some studies that said if we did nothing, in reality, there probably wouldn't be a radiation hazard. Now I'm not suggesting that. We probably need to do something, but this whole question of reclassifying the definition of what is high level waste and so forth. It makes so much sense to use science rather than where it comes from. And I know that that's very, very controversial, but we should follow science. And I think that most people, I think here as science would agree that that's what we should do. Use the science. What constitutes that radiation? It's not where it comes from. What's there? And we kind of joked when we were putting on this conference back in 2018 that if we succeeded in showing that low-level radiation was not a hazard, that half the people at Hanford would be laid off. In other words, we wouldn't be very popular people. But we are spending an enormous amount of money to in some ways, with very little actual profit. The thing that bothered Hanford at Fukushima, they scraped off about the top 4 inches of soil, topsoil, and they put it in bags, and they lowered the radiation by about a factor of 2, which was already well below background. And I said, as a farmer, I understand the value of topsoil. I would love to have that soil brought here to Ingalls Creek and spread over our rocks so we could actually grow something. It's that somehow, because it's radiation, that scares people and they've got to get rid of it. Now, we got high level radiation in those tanks. We need to deal with them. But so we don't just stop. I would, to stop. But I suspect that if we took a hard look at where science was really followed and look at the risks involved and so forth, that we could cut off a lot of the work that's going on at Hanford.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is from Jim Catlin. Is anyone doing any PR papers regarding the 2 advanced reactor demonstration reactors that highlights their passive safety? The other public fear is meltdown as well as low-level exposure.
Well, there's been a lot of work. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen the work on these 2 reactors that are scheduled to go at Hanford, but there have been a lot of papers written on the pebble-bed reactors, sodium-cooled reactors that show that they just can't melt down. The small reactors have one great advantage of the big reactors, and that is that the big reactors, if you look at just the surface to volume ratio, those things, the neutrons leak out, and so they have. Well, let's just take the sodium reactor. Some of you are probably familiar with the small EBR2 reactor, which at Idaho Falls, where they actually shut off all the safety system, shut off all the power, and just let it go. Well, you look out for the molten stuff all over the floor. It shut down by itself. It just expanded. It shut down. They started the reactor back up that afternoon. No fuel damage. At FFTF, my job at FFTF was to blow it up. On the computer. Make sure you hear that part, on the computer. I mean, we had to go through licensing processes with the regulatory people. And I remember when we put in a device, what's called a gem, which basically allowed neutrons to leak out when it was shut down. And again, I remember I was going out to the site when it was at 50% power, which is 200 megawatts thermal, and all the safety systems were shut down, and the countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2. And if I had a flashback 10 years earlier, I thought, oh my God, the whole thing's going to melt down. Well, of course it didn't. It shut down all by itself. And so those kind of characteristics are built into these smaller reactors, and there have been tons and tons of papers put out. I don't know of any one specific to the TerraPower reactor or the one for XL, but there have been a lot of generic studies done to show that these small reactors intrinsically shut themselves down and can get rid of the heat. It's not just shutting themselves down. The Fukushima reactors all shut themselves down after the earthquake, 9.1 or something earth magnitude, and they were only designed for something less than that. They shut down. The reactors were operating perfectly well, except for the tsunami came through, wiped out their backup generators, their diesel generators. They need to have cooling because there is as we all know, a nuclear reactor has this fission product continue to heat. So it's not just shutting your reactor down, you have to get rid of the heat. And these small reactors, again, because they're smaller, they basically, most of them just use air convection to come in and cool them down. Lots and lots of studies showing that these small reactors have very intrinsic shutdown features. It's really kind of exciting from that standpoint.
Now, Jim Morris, you had a question that I wasn't quite able to, something about Tony Brooks' biology and radiation. You want to clarify that? You might have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, what I was thinking about, maybe I wanted to ask Alan about where they are as far as their paper is concerned. I know Tony personally, and I was thinking maybe we could consider, I'll contact Tony and see if he can join us sometime and talk about radiation biology in a lot more detail. So, really great guy.
He's a great guy. Yeah, I say, he's just an aw shucks guy that how can you get mad at him no matter what he does? He's a very capable guy.
Yeah, I
feel very important.
Yeah.
Okay, Ben Johnson has a question.
Alan, I was wondering if you'd had a chance to chat with Bruce Napier about his analysis of the data from the MIAC plant, the accidents and the whole experience that they've had there, because he claims that that data does support the LNT model.
I think if you ask them, is this really a scientific model? I think they would say no. They would not. But it's not in the data. To get Tony Brooks on it would be really helpful, because the DOE has done some recent studies in Russia at the MIAC, and that's not inconsistent with the LNT. Tony would question that because some of the stuff which they say, no, wait a minute, it's only the strontium only goes to the bone. You can't use it. In other words, I can't articulate why, but with how the epidemiology studies are actually, the problem is that the LNT people simply refuse to look at the biology. And and to me, I guess, intrinsically, as I said earlier, everything that we know of has some kind of a threshold. We're afraid of electrocution at 400 volts, but we hold batteries in our hand. I mean, no matter what you look at, there are the poise in the dose. And to somehow really assume that somehow at low level radiation that's really harmful intrinsically doesn't make sense. Now you have to have more than just that. You have to have the data, but that's where the biologists, I think, are coming up with some very good data. Now we're trying to, one of the ANS proposals is to encourage the Department of Energy to conduct a long-term low-dose program where they really decide at the front end, what are we going to look for, get the biologists and the epidemiologists to agree on the way that science is done. So when they get the data, they have to agree. Well, that's still floating around, and I think something like $50 million have put into that by appropriations. But let's see, there's two versions: appropriations and it hasn't been actually put together. And I suspect it's going to take a long-term program to do that. And I hate to say this, but I think to some extent, some of the old LNTers are going to have to pass away. I mean, the young people, we had a lot of young people at the conference in Pasco that are good biologists, and they're seriously asking questions. So I guess that's one hope that I have for the future. The young people are going to more seriously look at the biology and come up with a better answer for why we just should not be fearful of this low-level radiation. I guess to me, again, is that there's a strong bit of ethics. Well, I said earlier, when the people say, well, okay, it may not be scientifically accurate, but it's conservative. But if we kill 1,600 people after Fukushima, they died, not because of radiation, but because of the fear of radiation, then I say it's not conservative. That's what's driving me in my gut.
Yes. Hi, Dr. Waltar. I was thinking about the answer to the question about publishing your forthcoming paper. And I really like the idea that you're thinking about long and short versions. And you may even want to think about a third, which is one that is more general public oriented. But I'm thinking that for your short version, if your target audience is science policymakers, you might want to consider the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the PNAS, because that gets to with the NAS and premature, it has that reach, but then it's pretty influential in Congress and elsewhere.
Good point. I'd love to get there. We've even thought of something like the Atlantic Monthly or New York Weekly, those kinds of things, but this kind of information to past an editor, I don't know. But Greg, it's a good suggestion to somehow to get the message out. It's a very difficult thing. And, though I thought even about 60 Minutes, somehow the American, somehow we've been, led down the primrose path. I just don't know if there's a way to expose that, so to speak. Can you still hear me here?
Yeah, you
anybody?
Out for a
Scott,
minute,
can you hear me?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a guy by the name of Ed Calabrese at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, who has done a lot of work, and I mean he's probably published 15 or 20 papers looking at how this whole LNT thing came about. It started way back in the mid-20s or something, where Herman Mueller got a Nobel Prize by showing that when he radiated fruit flies, that somehow this linear relationship existed. Well, there are two problems with that. Number one, it was not low-level radiation. It was very high-level radiation. Number two, he was aware that, in fact, at low-level radiation, there were conflicting results. He flat out lied. And he got his Nobel Prize, which gave him credibility. Well, basically, that kind of kept festering up to the National Academy of Sciences in the 1950s. They did several studies, and Calabrese has gone into how these studies were done. Many of the studies were people that were appointed by the Rockefeller Foundation. They were interested in oil. Oil was concerned about nuclear coming along. And again, some of these are kind of subjective, but he's got a lot of not emails, but can correspond to show they were very concerned. The National Academy was very concerned about stopping atmospheric testing. Well, one way to do that is show that radiation is bad. And they were successful. So they adopted, that's when they officially adopted the LNT. Prior to that, it had been a threshold model. And on. He's done several papers on here. In fact, we're trying to figure out a way to get some of his papers into readable form by the general public, because it shows that there's a huge conspiracy, a scientific, a serious ethical question associated with the science that went behind this LNT. But they were successful in showing it's bad, and people love fear. People thrive on fear. So it's so deeply inculcated in the world now that radiation is bad, no matter what level. It's so difficult to refute. But I think we just have to keep working at it with every play we can. It's at high levels it's bad stuff, but at low levels it's not. Jim, you have any comment on that?
I guess what I would say was I totally agree with you, and I do know that there was a real proponent in the Department of Energy by the name of Marvin Fraser, who we lost here about 6 months ago. He finally died from cancer, but after being under treatment for almost 25 years. Marv had the low dose program for the Department of Energy and was really a strong proponent of low dose and trying to get at this. And they funded a lot of studies looking at molecular level effects and so forth, and even to some extent the whole idea of hormesis and how it comes to play. And we know hormesis occurs in almost every place we look. I think of electric power industry and all the money they've put into supporting electric and magnetic field effect. P&L became the lab of no effects because people would demonstrate effects. And when we investigated long enough and worked out the systems they were using, we usually found the artifacts. And your comments about the original people dealing with radiation and not telling the truth and the whole truth really brought that to my heart as well. And I think these are the critical things that need to be done.
Yeah.
And we're biological systems. We're built to respond to the conditions we're in, and we have resilience of being able to do that. And to me, the threshold effect is clear. It's never been a problem, as far as I'm concerned. But I was formed in the minds of people before me on the whole subject, so it's never been the linear effect. Just did not make sense to me.
The interesting thing about this application of COVID-19, if somehow we could get, there are studies underway right now, and so far they're really quite positive that we can use low-level radiation to thwart off the cytokine, the immune system that goes wacky. But very, very few medical people will even allow the possibility. And if we could do that, that to me could be a breakthrough. People recognized low-level radiation actually had some really beneficial effects and keep people from dying from COVID. But there's this huge barrier to overcome to get the medical people to use it. And to me, this is another. It's an ethical question. I mean, this is very frustrating.
Well, I think part of it's driven from the fact that we always look for an answer, and once we put something in a box on the shelf, we know that box is there, so there's my answer. So I don't need to think about it anymore. And that's just not life. I'm sorry.
No, that's right. That's right.
Oh, this is great. I really appreciated this.
Well,
are there any other questions?
I think the purpose of the program is to let people share their passions.
Well, and we certainly really appreciate your sharing. Are there any other questions that?
Well, I don't know if Alan's still on, but when we were talking about the LNT curve and stuff like that, I don't know if you're going to get much traction talking about the beneficial end of the curve. But when I've talked to people about where you are on the curve, and I just relate things to where background radiation is, people are really shocked at the difference in level. That's really a very powerful point. And in Alan's book, I told him this when we were up a while ago. It's got some great anecdotal explanations of that. Like, for instance, if you're standing in the Capitol Rotunda, you're getting more excess radiation from what's coming out of the granite in the rotunda than you would if you were sitting right next to a reactor. And so these are levels that people just don't know about. So they end up going black and white in their thinking, like, any radiation's bad, and no radiation is good, when in fact, people are willing to tolerate various levels of exposure without really thinking about it. And I think somehow we have to draw that line on background radiation. I was telling Alan, as a hobby, as an electrical engineer, I build Geiger counters as a hobby. And I've demonstrated them to people when I show them my designs, and they hear it clicking and they say, well, is that from some source you have on your workbench here? I said, no, that's just coming down from the sky. And they're just alarmed by this. So there's just a very low level of education in terms of the threshold of what background is relative to other things. That's very persuasive with people.
Alan, you cut the last bit of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I got that.
Yeah.
That's true. You know, one other thing, in terms of the threshold model, this guy, Tony Brooks, grew up in St. George, Utah. And that's just west of the Jackass Flats, where a lot of atmospheric testing was atomic bomb testing. And then the fallout would, flow over Jackass Flats, or flow over St. George. Well, it turned out there was one test called Dirty Harry, I think it was, that somehow there's atmospheric conditions changed. It bounced off the Grand Canyon, came over St. George, and it was a pretty high level. So at that time, the AE through town with megaphones, take cover, but they didn't evacuate. George got was 3 times that of the citizens of Japan in Fukushima. Okay, so it was a more serious accident, but they didn't evacuate because they used a threshold model. Look at the difference. Fukushima today, this tragedy where it has this blight of you can't sell their food and so forth. It's considered like a leper colony, if you will, in a sense. St. George had a population of 5,000 at that time. It's now 100,000. It's a destination resort. The difference in using a threshold model and not a threshold model is black and white. I mean, it's just enormous. And another thing that, anybody that's open to any kind of reason would say, wow, what a difference. Why are we sticking with this crazy LNT model? Well, Scott, I don't know how long you want to try to put up with this crazy guy here and this internet that's unstable. But,
as far as I'm concerned, you can go on all afternoon, but I recognize that, other people may have other things they got to do, but
sure.
Jim will stick around. Okay, yeah.
Well, I've got another question. It's a little off topic from the low-level radiation, but it's about the future of fast reactors.
Uh-huh.
And it's just basically this. I think, Alan and I, when we talked, there's another angle you can work on in terms of recycling. The whole issue of recycling is very popular with people. And when you look at fast reactors, in a way, you're sort of recycling, right? You're coming out with more fuel in the end. Nobody knows this in the general public. So I was talking to a fellow, just an analog to that, about lithium batteries for cars. And I says, the mining for lithium batteries is pretty egregious. He says, oh, that's okay. We're going to recycle the old batteries. Well, and that's true. but the whole recycling mindset is something that we can use here too. But unfortunately, fast reactors, France let all of theirs stop. I think what are the only ones left are maybe in India. So how do we get the recycling message with fast reactors out?
That's a good point, because when people talk about nuclear waste, I tend to not use that term anymore. It's a used fuel, if you will, because 97% of what we call nuclear waste is actually fuel, could be recycled and into a fast spectrum system. Now, it's more expensive to do that because there's another step involved, but you're absolutely right. It can be used. And that's why we could extend the really develops the fast breeder reactor will win the race. And we've dropped out. Now, there is a reactor a test reactor. It's under design at Idaho, as most of you know, called the VTR, Versatile Test Reactor. It's basically an FFTF in a smaller system, and it's a pool system rather than a loop system. People said, okay, we need a test reactor because fast reactors have a lot of interesting characteristics. And of course, some of us say, why not restart the FFTF? But that's politically not feasible. And so there's an interest. But yeah, fast reactors are, and that's part of my blood. I think they're marvelous. And you're right, France had a super Phoenix reactor. It was shut down again for political reasons. We make crazy political decisions. In fact, in France, interesting, not just fast reactors, they were 78% nuclear with their regular water reactors, leading the world. And now the current administration wants to shut them back to 50% or something and get more solar and food. I mean, it's just crazy. It's crazy. Italy, of course, is non-nuclear, but they're importing nuclear power from France and so forth.
Okay, I just have a quick comment here. One of the biggest problems I see is a communication problem. The science world will follow your arguments when you publish your papers into the scientific journals. The scientific people will read them, they'll understand them. You may change some hearts and minds that way. But this message needs to be brought down. It needs to be on blogs. It needs to be something out there on Facebook. It needs to be on Instagram and Twitter. There needs to be a turning of the public perception. I was so encouraged when you mentioned that there are young scientists out there that are starting to take up the mantle and starting to push the message. But until you change the public's mind, you're not going to change the political will. And if we allow this continual blinders being left on to the general public, we're going to see more and more countries regressing. We're going to see more and more countries coming off of the nuclear. There's got to be a better way of messaging and branding and getting it out. Scientific journals will only get this portion of the population.
Terry, can I say something? You're absolutely right. But it could be depressing, but it would be probably be censored. It would draw a ton of censorship in the climate.
We got to get Taylor Swift on board. That'll do it.
Well,
Yeah.
the reality is scientists are not very good communicators. You know, that's part of our problem. We talk to ourselves. So we do need to have some other avenue to get to the public.
Well, again, I think Terry's right, and I liked, Alan, your comment about, you know, could you get to 60 Minutes or NPR or whoever, and I think if you could get the scientific paper published, and then get the shorter one aimed at the policymakers published, then you might be able to take a next step and say, okay, is there a science writer at 60 Minutes or at NPR that we get interest in this, and almost proceed in a stepwise fashion. But it does take some missionary work.
But those are also probably an older,
That's a good point.
more educated and more select audience. I'm thinking John Q. Public. I don't know how many people under the age of 50 go to 60 Minutes or NPR or anything like that for information.
Well, that's why I was serious about Taylor Swift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Ben Johnson, you had your hand up. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Prominent in the objection, though, to nuclear power is the cost. If we could get rid of the LNT, would it have an impact, really serious impact on the cost of nuclear? Because right now that is a huge, huge impediment.
Yeah, Ben, I think that's a great question. I have been asking that question to lots and lots of people because I have not seen a credible study to answer that question. I've talked to the TerraPower people and others, and they say, well, you know, it may not have that big effect on the reactor design and the building because we have to have shielding up there and so forth for other reasons. Probably the biggest benefit would come in operations, where we could drastically reduce the the size of the area around there and the staff and so forth and so on. But I don't know the answer to that. People kind of say, oh, it would save billions and blah, blah, blah. But I have not seen a good study. And I think, Ben, that is a really good question. If we could answer that with credibility, then I think that would be really important, because my gut feeling is it could reduce the cost considerably if you look at the whole operation. But I don't know how to answer that with data.
Well, one thing I think you can safely say is that an awful large quantity of that cost is because of delay. And it's this putting it off because people can raise a budget. So you could say, well, at least if you could get rid of the fear of radiation, you might have an impact on the delay. And that could have a huge, huge impact on cost.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's right. That's really a good point. Delays are what really drives these costs up. Yeah. Overnight cost is one thing, but the actual is so much controlled by the delays. And yeah, and all people, I think fear does have a lot to do with causing those delays. A good point.
Are those delays triggered by regulatory hurdles and inspections? Is that it?
No, I think they're caused by people raising objections which they go through the regulatory process to achieve them. But I don't think that they are necessarily instigated by existing regulatory situations.
I was going to say, and when you get into the debates about costs, then you're fighting a losing battle, because
Really,
when alternative energy sources have so much subsidizing from the government, it skews any kind of balanced discussions on the cost of the energy.
But the other thing is that a lot of these other systems can come in bit by bit. In other words, you can build a small solar plant or a small wind plant. It's pretty tough to make a small nuclear plant.
Although I hear that's changing.
Well, that's right. People have said for a long time, you can't make the small plants economically viable. It's cost of the big plants, you got a site and so forth. And in fact, to some extent, there's an argument there. We don't know if these new small plants can be economically, they all look good on paper, but the one advantage is, and you're right, you can build them in smaller units. And like NuScale, I think the basic unit is 50 megawatts or something like that. You put 12 of them together and you got 600 megawatts, whatever. So you can do it in pieces. And not only that, you can start generating power while the rest of them is being put together. And that time delay that you talked about, that's what's costing so much money. So I don't know if we're going to be able to show that the new small plants are going to be that effective economically. We won't really know until we start building them, but they have that potential. And of course, the other potential is to be able to site these in countries or places where they don't have a grid big enough to support. There are places in the world you can't put a 1,200 megawatt plant. You don't want to have more than 20 or 30% of the grid on any one source. And so, those small plants have a lot of attraction in many parts of the world. And of course, the Russians know this, the Chinese know this, even the Koreans know that. And that's why they're going after these markets. And here we kind of sit here twiddling our thumbs. Fortunately, we're starting to get more aggressive, but it's a pretty steep hill that we need to climb.
Well, and I think I read on the advanced nuclear reactors, especially the one in Richland, it was meant to, there are 80 megawatts, but the plan has to expand to 4 to come up to 320. So the idea was to do one plant, learn from that, do a second plant, economize and efficientize until when you get to the 4th one, you actually got, you have an evolved design that really is economized.
At some point, I'll be able to go to Costco and get the 4-pack of them. And yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I'm optimistic. I think there's a lot of virtue here. The concern is that everything looks good on paper, until you start building it, you really start learning.
Is the focus still on a modular approach?
Repeat that, Jim.
Is the focus still on a modular approach as far as building these?
I don't think Alan's hearing you.
Yeah, I know that's what the impression I had when I read the article in the paper recently.
I'm sorry. What? Could you repeat that? Yeah, I didn't hear it, Jim.
Oh, is the focus still on a modular approach as far as the reactors now? That you can put groups together?
I think that most of them are looking like that. I'm not sure about the Terra power plant because it's a little bit bigger to begin with, but most of them are talking about modular, being able to, put chunk here, chunk there kind of thing. And to be able to put them on a truck or something to, move them in so you don't have to have this, you can build, basically one of the advantages, in addition to the safety characteristics and the size, is a lot of the construction can be done in factory. So you have a lot less work to do. And that is presumably would be one of the cost savings. It's an exciting time if we can move ahead with some of these reactors at Hanford. Some of you people like Ben, like you, Jim, and so forth, you young people may well see this thing through. Ken, yeah, you're one of those young guys, right?
I have one of these. Does that help at all?
I love the hexagons. You better believe it.
Yeah.
Well, we've got to keep the faith. I mean, I think we have a responsibility, and frustrating as it might be, we just have to keep chipping away. I think ultimately, was it Winston Churchill probably said it right. He said, Americans always do the right thing after they've exhausted all other possibilities. And, here we are. Here we're going, this, that, and the other thing. In the end, I think that's where we will finally get there. But it's going to be a tough job.
It makes me wonder if we're not going to have to be in the throes of a severe energy crisis before the public opinion will shift away from or shift toward nuclear.
I think we need another one of your cartoon books to put that point across.
Well, I think the recent, yeah, right. Well, I hope we learn a little bit from the recent Texas thing, where they're so darn, we're independent kind of thing. We're not dependent on anybody else. We are a republic, blah, blah, blah. And look what happened.
Yeah.
During that time, if I've seen, in fact, Jim, you sent me Jim Catlin, you sent me the actual data, I think, during the crisis down there where, wind was up and down, everything was up and down and so forth. Nuclear was flat, except unfortunately, one of their 4 plants had a problem not in the reactor itself, but on the other side where they had to shut it down, which is too bad. Other than that, that would just flat nuclear's power. So I don't know if the Texans will learn from this or the national politicians, but boy, having that constant power, no matter what, is really, really important.
Well, and I might add one other kind of public conception problem is how long it takes to develop anything. And so there's kind of a competing horse race right now when you talk to people who are into renewable energy, and I tell them, well, you got to have something to power your house when the sun's out and when the wind's not blowing. And they go, oh yeah, well that's being worked on. And I said, well, do you know how those kind of novel technologies? I mean, they're starting from scratch, a lot of them. And then you weigh that against what you have on a relatively healthy development on nuclear reactors, which it's just a huge bootstrap. You could start from there, do a little bit of development, and you would be there. But the public, I came out of research and development. The public has no clue the kind of time it takes to come up with those fundamental storage technologies when you got one sitting in your hand right now with nuclear energy. And that education problem is one I run up against all the time.
Yeah.
Well, it's 2:45.
Oh yeah.
That we have, but I want to thank you, Alan, for joining us so much. This has been really, really fascinating, and I hope it will not be the last conversation on this topic. We would love to be able to continue this conversation, and also thank you for the rest of you for joining us. Dan, do you have anything to add?
I just want to add my own thanks to Alan for taking the time to share with us and for your example of sticking with something that I think of William Wilberforce and his sense of call to address issues in this world and to stick with it through an awful lot of difficulty and challenge and wonder and opposition. And you have, as I go back and read your book from '85, the story, the voice is there as relevant today, at least, if not more so than even then. So I just want to encourage you to keep responding to God's call amongst us. And if you know of a good retreat center in this vicinity where we could have faith and science conversations, please speak up, because it would be great once we get this, Lord willing, get this pandemic stuff squared away to meet in person. It would be wonderful to have a group go up from the Tri-Cities and discuss faith and science and host a conference like you mentioned to some of us. So
yep.
Thank you.
I'll look into that, see if I can find a spot.
Yeah.